All right. Well, it's 1 o'clock Eastern time here, so we will get started. So thank you so much for all of you who are here. My name is Paul Meyer. I'm the editor of Acres USA magazine. And today's presentation and Q&A session with John Kempf will focus on how to make choices on what kinds of agricultural technologies to adopt and the philosophical thoughts behind that. We're going to engage in the proud tradition of counter programming today, not talking at all about the election or politics. We're gonna talk about agriculture, and I think this will be hopefully a nice change for a lot of us, and not think about that for a while. Today's webinar is sponsored by USDA's new TOP program, the Transition to Organic Partnership Program, which is a new initiative from USDA that's providing support to farmers to transition to organic, includes funding for mentorship programs. As I mentioned, John is the host of our webinar today. He's the founder of AEA, the executive editor of Acres USA magazine, and lots of other things. Our format today is John's gonna present for 15, 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for Q&A. So if you would like to ask a question, there is a little Q&A box down at the bottom. I've already got a couple coming in, and we will take a look at those questions and feed them to John, or he can be reading them as well. And this webinar is being recorded, and it will be up on our Acres USA website, and AA will have that as well, that they'll be sending out on their social media channels. acresusa.com. We have our event, our EcoAg conference coming up early in December 2 through 5. So keep that in mind. And with that, pass it over to John.
All right. Thank you, Paul. Welcome, everyone. It's a delight to see all of you here. And to just echo Paul's comments, please, I have some thoughts that I want to share, things that I want to talk about, but I really am looking forward to having a lot of discussion. So any questions that you have related to developing technologies or related to how we might think about the adoption of various technologies, please put those in the Q&A box, and let's have a good discussion. Let's have a good conversation around those. So when we think about technology, we have all seen our lives touched by technology much more than they have in the past. Over the last, some of us are much more innovative and adopters of new technology, new innovations, new ideas. But there has been almost like a phase shift over the last 6 years, 5 to 6 years. It started a little bit before COVID, but was then amplified with COVID, where it's now normal for almost anyone, majority of people, to participate in Zoom webinars or meetings like this one. It's become a routine way that we connect with each other and interact. And while the technology of video conferencing has been around for a decade plus, never has it been so widely used and adopted as it has been recently. And obviously it has many strengths. It allows us to connect and to collaborate, to develop relationships with people at a distance that we might not otherwise get to easily meet. And but arguably those relationships also are seldom, not saying it's impossible, because it can and does happen, but they're seldom to the same depth, the same degree of authenticity and personal heart-to-heart connection as they are when those meetings happen in person. And so there have been, technology has many strengths. It can bring many strengths to society and to a culture, but it can also be very destructive and can strain relationships, can cause relationships to be disassociated. And so there are a lot of things that I think all of us, probably, if you're showing up for this webinar, then to some degree you've probably already thought about some of the potential challenges with technology. And particularly for me coming from um, my background, actually before I shift to talking about what my personal journey has been looking like, there is since we're on the topic of Zoom webinars and presentations, during COVID, a lot of conferences went to a virtual experience because they were unable to have their events live, and so we went to a lot of virtual conferences, and webinars became very prolific, and the abundance of information about regenerative agriculture and about this type of a different aspect of agronomy just flourished online. It became today there are so many resources, so much information available on YouTube and on social media channels, various people's blogs and so forth, and that some of that, a fraction of that existed 5 years ago, but it has just proliferated where now it is much easier for people to access and to learn and get new information about these types of agricultural approaches. And that's been a good thing. However, it was very clear to see that I'm not quite sure how to articulate this idea, but it was quite obvious that it seems to me that there was a degree of innovation stifling that occurred when people no longer engaged to the same degree at conferences in those direct face-to-face conversations, those hallway conversations. There was a degree of idea sparking when you start having conversations with each other, when we start having conversations with each other about specific problems, specific challenges that other people might have encountered, might have perspective or insights on. And that aspect was stifled to a large degree when we went to a digital online venue instead of an in-person venue. And so there is one of the things that I'm very optimistic about or hopeful for is that we get more attendees coming to live events and conferences that are perhaps better informed. They have more information. They have been able to learn more at home. They've been able to have conversations with people virtually. But now they come to an event and they are even better informed than they've ever been before. And the quality of the conversation is better than it's ever been. And an interesting example of that is the way that that Acres USA has evolved over the last year with Taylor Henry guiding it and taking it in a much more constructive direction than it has been managed in the past. And the perfect kind of the epitome of that is the conference that is coming up here in another month or so at the beginning of December. We have when you look at the roster, the lineup of presenters, I've been to, safe to say, hundreds of conferences in the soil health and ecological agriculture and regenerative agriculture space over the last decade and a half. And I've never been to an event once where Jay Fear and Gabe Brown and Will Harris and Joel Salazar are at the same event, and Alan Williams, and the list goes on and on. It's like we have a confluence of presenters that is coming together the first week of December this year that I have never observed and experienced the like before. And so I would highly encourage every one of you, if there is one event that you want to go to this winter, this is one that you do not want to miss. This is going to be, I think, the event of a lifetime, because when you have a group of presenters of such remarkable quality, not only is the value of the information in the presentations extremely valuable, but that also escalates the quality of the hallway conversations. You have much more in-depth conversations, and there is expedited learning that can happen in that type of environment that isn't easily replicated anywhere else. And so I would highly encourage all of you to consider attending. I'm going to be there for the entire week, for the entire event. And I am really looking forward to it because I don't think there's been anything similar in this space ever that I have observed. So that'll be a lot to look forward to. So that is kind of that's the opposite end of the spectrum from where we've been the last 4 or 5 years, or where a lot of events have been during the COVID era of being a digital online event. We will have the opportunity for in-person conversations to a depth and degree that I believe we very seldom have the opportunity to experience. So coming back to thinking about technology and technological innovation, as I think most of you are aware, I come from an Amish community, an Amish background, and the Amish are not monolithic. There are many different Amish denominations with many different degrees of conservatism and the adoption and the use of technology. Obviously, I'm here speaking with you on Zoom and a conversation that is being recorded. So as you can guess, the denomination and the community that I'm a part of and the church district that I'm a part of is not of the most conservative. And yet I come from that cultural background that is very, very wary of adopting new technologies and generally quite slow and quite averse to adopting new technologies. And my one of my default patterns in life has always been to try to understand and to analyze the root causes of why are things a certain way. And I applied that same type of questioning to the Amish community restrictions. Why did we choose? Why did the Amish church choose to, in prior generations, in many cases, why did they choose to disallow the use of electricity and to disallow television and radios and now cell phones and even landline phones in some cases, smartphones? Why were those choices and decisions made? Why not permit the use of flying and whatever the case might be? And again, none of these are universal. There's a spectrum within the Amish community as there is with humans and people in general. But when you start digging into trying to understand why those choices were made, trying to understand the core values behind those choices, they invariably come from a place of having an intense desire to maintain a strong family culture and a strong community culture. It was a very people-centric approach. So the reason for not permitting the use of television and radio, for example, is because they wanted to preserve a strong family dinner table culture of having the entire family. There is still, to this day, it is strongly advocated to have a family culture of the entire family sitting down together to eat together as often as possible, at least one meal per day, but preferably 2 or 3 meals per day. And so it was that desire to preserve the strong family culture was at the foundation of television and radio. It is the desire to preserve a strong community culture where community actively supports each other and helps each other out with harvesting or with barn raisings or in the event of an accident or emergency. That was the foundation of not permitting the use of vehicles or flying. They wanted people to be in close enough geographic proximity to each other that they could easily and readily go help each other out. So it's not that we believe that cars are wrong or that flying is wrong. It's that there is a desire to preserve the strong community fabric that is enhanced and enabled when people are in close geographic proximity to each other. So what has brought this forward for me, thinking about this cultural context and the strong community context, and thinking about the direction that agriculture has gone over the last 50 years and the direction that it appears to be headed in the near-term future, one of the challenges that we have encountered in our work at AEA is that in order to do a really good job of regenerative agronomy, there is such a thorough, broad, generalistic knowledge base required. There is the need to have fairly robust and workable understanding of entomology and plant physiology and biophysics and biochemistry and soil microbiology and just phytohormones, botany. The list goes on and on and on. It seems to be this very broad domain where you need to have a, a more than just a shallow surface knowledge of in order to tie these pieces together, in order to integrate, in order to be able to understand how a certain insect pest is, why it's showing up, and how that corresponds to plant nutritional profiles, and how to manage those plant nutritional profiles to produce resistance is not something that's facilitated easily with deep knowledge in only one or two areas. You need much more broader knowledge than that. And of course, um, so the need for us as an organization, as we grow and expand, there's been a need. One of the challenges and the limitations has been how do you recruit and hire and train and support people who have that broad base of knowledge? Because there are significant investments required in obviously finding those people, but then in training them and supporting them. And that becomes a limiting factor to the number of people that we can reach. And we have the, we have no desire uh, to be everything to everyone. We can't work with all growers. We have no desire to do that, but we do have a desire to be the leader in the space, to set such a high standard of excellence that other people are forced to change the way they do business as a result of our presence in the marketplace. And so that need to onboard people or there is this need to make this deep knowledge more broadly and readily available, both to agronomists, but also to farmers and to growers. And then there are a large group of growers who don't desire to know. The way it's been described to me is that there are many growers who desire to have just a paint by numbers approach to agronomy. It's like, here are the things you do at this stage, and this is the approach that we're going to take, and go do it. And I appreciate that all of us have different skill sets and strengths, different things that we are strong at. I remember Gary Zimmer years ago used to say that in order to be a good dairy farmer, the very best dairy farmers are you have the options of being a good herdsman, a good cow person, a good crops and plants person, or a good mechanic and good at machinery and equipment. And in order to be a successful dairy farmer, you had to be at least two out of the three. And so I recognize that there are many growers and many farmers whose skill set isn't particularly, whose desire isn't to particularly deeply understand all the agronomic and plant physiology pieces that I get so excited about. But it also, what also has emerged is that if we have this deeply developed ecosystem knowledge and we hold that inside of advancing ecoagriculture, how do we democratize that? How do we make it more broadly accessible? And so it's from that question and from this idea that developed back in 2010 and 11 and 12 when I first realized the implications of what the possibilities were with plant sap analysis to predict disease and insect susceptibility into the future. I realized that the possibility existed to digitize a lot of this information and to predict disease and insect susceptibility into the future based on a plant's nutritional profile, and also to when you have the ability to predict disease and insect susceptibility into the future, that means you can also formulate why you have a high degree of susceptibility and what to do about it from a microbiome management and a nutrition management perspective. And this to me was really exciting because it would completely change the nature of the conversation in several very important ways. One is it would change the conversation from reactive management to proactive management. Instead of waiting to respond to disease and insect pressure once it showed up, you would actually be able to respond proactively before they showed up in the first place as a result of being able to see susceptibility factors. And second, it would change the conversation from a conversation of pest control with pesticides to pest prevention with nutrition management and microbiome management. So I became really enthusiastic about the implications of developing technology that might deliver on this promise. And I first sketched out an outline of all the various factors and the interactions that I observed and how we would be able to put this together back in 2014. I first sketched an outline of what I, at the time, called an AI agronomist. And that idea, that project, was put on the shelf for the next decade for a number of very good reasons. One of them being that I believed we were a few years away from the development of sensors that could measure plant nutritional profiles and microbiome profiles in the field in close to real time, and that this type of digital platform would be facilitated by that sensor development. Well, here we are a decade later. We now stand on the threshold of having those sensors readily available. And so within advancing eco-agriculture, we talked about this a little bit in our community fundraising round that we did spring or last fall, I forget. And so we spoke about some of the concepts, the ideas that we are working on. So inside AEA, we are actively working on how do we develop technology that can take the information that exists that we have developed, the intellectual property that we have developed, which is how do you predict disease and insect susceptibility, and how do you respond to those predictions? How do you manage it? How do you prevent it? These are all systems that we have developed. How do we digitize that information and democratize it and make it readily available to anyone, anywhere? People who are growing quarter-acre market garden, as well as people who are growing 10,000 acres of higher value crops. So across the spectrum, how do we make this information much more readily accessible? And so it's been in thinking about this project over the last several years and developing it internally and preparing for releasing it in the future that I've been thinking a great deal about how do we design technology. One of our foundational pieces in our work at Advancing Eco-Agriculture is I don't want us to be a company that does regenerative agriculture or that does regeneration. I want AEA to be a company that is regenerative right down inherently into our DNA. And so we think deeply, I think deeply about the relationships that we have with our employees, with our customers, with the people we buy raw materials from, and how are those relationships being nurtured and being supported so that they are not extractive and so that we're not degrading those relationships. And so being a company that is regenerative rather than is just doing regenerative is something that is quite important. And that translates also to how do we develop these software platforms? How do we develop them to facilitate and to enhance regeneration? And from that thought process emerged this article that appeared a week or so ago in Acres USA on designing technology for regeneration. And I'm not going to regurgitate all the points that I made in the article, but I think the fundamental piece when it comes to thinking about how we design technology is that technology can be designed to enhance people's inherent strengths or to enhance their inherent skills. That cannot be replaced by technology. Or it can be designed with the intention of replacing people with kind of this foundational ethos that um, that mechanical computer brains are better than human brains, and that um, we should therefore seek to replace the human brains. And this does a tremendous disservice to the human dynamic if we think about humans only as walking computers, because we are much more than that, particularly in the context of caring for and stewarding for landscapes. In this context, we have not just an intellectual capacity to observe and to integrate those observations, but also we have an ability to perceive that isn't possible with technology. It will never be possible with technology, because no matter how many sensors we develop, no matter what multitude of parameters we are able to measure, even if we can measure 100,000 things, 100,000 different variables on every acre and every different ecosystem, those 100,000 variables will still not accurately capture and represent the whole. They will only capture fractions of the whole. And so it is our unique capacity to perceive and grasp the whole and how things are interacting with each other that is unique to human stewardship and observation, our ability to observe and our ability to perceive. The second unique characteristic that we bring is we have the capacity for intuitive perception. Call it conscience, call it spiritual awareness. We have this capacity for intuitive perception about whether things are going well, whether an animal or a block of trees or a field of a crop is stressed. We can perceive this intuitively, even when, in many cases, there are no visual indicators or even indicators on that sensors can pick up that can describe what is happening, that can describe that intuitive sense. And for those are skill sets, and there are probably others that I'm not thinking of or not mentioning right now. But in order to develop a technology that enhances regeneration, we need to develop technology with the specific intent of trying to enhance those unique skill sets, not to suppress them, not to take them away, but to enhance them. And so from that perspective, we think about this I think it's perhaps a Chinese proverb that says the best fertilizer is the footsteps of the farmer, or I've heard it translated as the best fertilizer is the shadow of the farmer. And that is the implication that foundational to good stewardship is our need to be out in the field and to be observing, to engage in that perception, that intuitive perception that cannot be replaced. And so there is this technological vision that has been proposed in numerous places by numerous people of someday having a farm that is farmed by a fleet of robots um, that is managed and guided by someone at a remote control station in their home or at some distant location. And that, I think, if we succeed in achieving that complete replacement of humans from the landscape, there's lots of spiritual connotations there about how that impacts the spiritual quality of food as well. But there's no question in my mind that at that point we have an agriculture that is very extremely mechanistic. When I say mechanistic, I'm not talking about the mechanized machines, but I'm talking about the food itself being mechanistic and no longer having the degree of nutrition and nourishment that we are looking for. But more importantly than that, for the moment, for this conversation, I don't believe such a type of agriculture can inherently be regenerative and can engage in good stewardship, because in order to engage in good stewardship, you have to be present on the landscape. You have to have humans engaged on the landscape. There are two fundamental views to how two fundamentally different views on the best way to regenerate ecosystems. The one worldview that espoused by environmentalists and others is that the best way to rewild or to regenerate an ecosystem is to remove humans from the landscape. And the other point of view, the one that I subscribe to, is that humans are a hyper keystone species, that when we engage with a landscape with conscious love and care and attention and intention, the conscious human management has the capacity to regenerate ecosystems faster than any other. And when you think about the historical landscapes that are held up by environmentalists as the epitome of what we should aspire to, whether that is the Amazonian rainforest, um, the Australian outback before the arrival of Europeans, the North American continent before the arrival of Europeans. You pick any moment in time in recent geological history about what is the ideal that we should aspire to, and those landscapes were almost universally managed by human hands and hearts and minds that were engaged. We now know that the North American continent and Central and South America and Australia, they were using the tools that they had at their disposal, tools of managing wildlife populations, using fire, etc., to planting trees to develop what today not managed as intensely as perhaps as what some modern agricultural systems are, but many of these systems were definitely managed and cared for and stewarded by human hands. And so if we want to have an agriculture in the future that is truly regenerative, we need to develop technology that enhances people's unique skill sets and enables them to be better stewards, and isn't inherently designed to remove people from the field and in their observational capacities, and to remove people from the farm generally. So yes, there are many technological innovations that can reduce the difficult labor requirements of farming. And I'm not suggesting that those should be avoided, but removing the observational skills, removing people from the field who are focused on observing and caring for and interacting with their plants and crops is something that I think we should avoid replacing at all costs. So there are other aspects that I could talk about, but if you haven't read it yet, first I would highly suggest and recommend that you subscribe to the monthly publication. This article that I wrote on designing technology for regeneration was published in the November issue. I don't know if it's been available on their website yet. I'm presuming that it has been, or if not, then it will be shortly. But please subscribe to the magazine if you don't, and please attend the conference. So with that, I'm going to open it up for Q&A. There's lots of pieces that I haven't touched on that I might have been able to, but I think this is a good starting point for us to kick off the conversation.
Thanks, John. And for some reason, only one of us is able to be on video here, which is fine. But per that article, we will be sharing that with all the attendees or everyone who signed up in an email afterwards here. It is available on our website, members.acresusa.com. And yeah, so that's a great article again from the November issue of Acres USA magazine. I think we should start out. You can see all these questions as well, but there's a couple about AI that I think are helpful. And this one directly is addressing the comment about replacing human observation. So the question is, especially during this initial phase of database build out that could be utilized for AI for prescriptive recommendations in agronomy, do you think that top level sensors, gold standard analysis like SAP analysis, DNA analysis, etc., that feed into AI interpretation can surpass trained human observation?
Do I think they can surpass it? It's an interesting question. I would perhaps frame it a little bit differently. I would say that they can measure different things and they measure it earlier. So they're not equal too. It's like comparing apples and oranges and saying, do really ripe oranges surpass the flavor profile of apples? It's not an equal comparison. They are very different things. So um, I would say that human observation, human perception has the ability to, we have the ability, perhaps the unique ability to assess the performance of the whole. We can look at an animal as a whole, or we can look at a field or a farm as a whole and gain a sense of its overall performance, its overall health, vitality, energy, etc. And so SAP analysis and DNA microbiome analysis and other types of sensor analytics and so forth can offer us further insights to support our observations, but they are measuring fractions of the whole and not the whole. They're measuring components, not the organism in its entirety. And so they are, I believe they're extremely valuable and useful and necessary tools to facilitate regeneration on scale, but they are not the only, I suppose if you put it into kind of somewhat mechanistic terms, the only sensor that has the capacity to perceive the organism as a whole is human perception, not individual sensors or lab analytics. That's the
I
way
think
I
I've heard you
look
say
at it.
this. Yeah, sorry. I think I've heard you say it this way before, that the AI might be able to see things in the data that we don't see, but it's not looking at all the data. There are outside
Yeah,
factors that it
yeah,
is not taking into account.
yeah. Thank you, Paul, for bringing me back on track here. That is an excellent point, and it brings up two other points that I want to touch on. Or actually, I'll elaborate on that point for the moment, and there's a separate point. Um, so when AI looks at large data sets, and there's AI, there's deep learning, machine learning. Um, when they look at large data sets of, let's say, plant nutritional profiles or microbiome profiles, and I have this experience with plant nutritional profiles, that you can look at plant nutritional profiles and you can try to evaluate which nutrients correlate with each other and which correspond to each other. And what emerges out of that, and this is a common phenomena in all of the omics domains of research, so metagenomics, metabolomics, and so forth, where we have these huge data sets. What can emerge out of that is the insight that, oh, these 10 things correlate to each other. Like when they all come up, they all rise and decline together, or they all move together in a certain pattern. But what it doesn't describe is what are the causal agents of that? What are the drivers? In other words, what is the driver and what's the symptom? And also, what is noise? What's completely irrelevant? So there is a need for understanding, human understanding of what drives these various factors to really understand what the data is revealing, and also to understand that some of the apparent correlations are just noise, just as exactly the same way I've seen this chart. I'm guessing many of you have seen it, that the consumption of the curve of ice cream consumption over the course of a 12-month cycle exactly matches the curve of shark attacks. Of course, obviously one has nothing to do with the other, except that it's summertime, more people are eating ice cream, more people are on the beach, and more people are getting bitten by sharks. But one doesn't directly, or even perhaps indirectly, have anything to do with the other. So the same can emerge, and not can, but does invariably emerge from the use of artificial intelligence to evaluate large data sets. You get a lot of noise, and human discernment is required to evaluate what is noise and what actually has relevance and what has value. So that's one point. The second point, to the point that you made, Paul, is that artificial intelligence is by It's in the name itself. It is inherently artificial. And when you think about perception, I spoke about how we have this unique capacity to perceive the whole. Artificial intelligence is artificial because it only has artificial perceptions. It only has visibility to the data that it is exposed to. And so if you have, earlier I made this fictitious number of, if you were measuring 100,000 different variables of an ecosystem, let's reduce that down to something that we can more easily comprehend and imagine. Let's say that we were measuring, I don't know, 10,000 variables of different microbial species and DNA profiles and nutritional profiles and meteorology, all of everything that we could today have the capacity to measure from a climate and soil and ecosystem perspective. If we were measuring all of that and we corresponded that to crop performance in terms of yield and storability and quality and flavor and so forth, I would expect that there would still be anomalies that would not be explained in the data, because the artificial intelligence, unless the information is included in the data set, it's not going to see that one block of fruit trees was pruned 2 weeks earlier than another, and because of what happened in the climate at that moment in time, that had an impact. It's not going to see that, I guess the essence in the point that I want to make in essence is that unless you include every single possible variable, it seems reasonable to expect that there will be root causes that will be outside the information that an artificial intelligence engine has access to. So it will never be able to track down what the root cause is of a certain thing. And also, it doesn't seem conceivable to me and realistic to be able to expect to include all the possible variables. There are too many. There are even too many that we don't know and don't understand at this point.
Following on that, there's a question slash comment that just came in from our Candelaria. I think you'll agree with. There are facts and there are data, but they only deal with what is, not what ought to be. So are you saying that's the exclusive province of humans and therefore what follows?
Yes, that's a great point. Thank you. And it reminds me, we're working on a project right now that I was spending some time working on it this morning, and it makes my head absolutely spin. Because one of the things that I've said very frequently is that most of us we have no perspective on what really healthy plants actually look like anymore, because most of us have never experienced them. And in describing the plant health pyramid, we've talked about how there are this kind of phase shift or this evolution of plant health where plants become resistant to different types of diseases and insects at the top of the pyramid that most people seldom get to observe. And what we are now we're discovering, or I am discovering, we have people on our team who've been connecting these dots for a while, but I'm now discovering that there is another layer of changed behavior where the phrase that comes to my mind for the moment is that when plants shift from getting nutrition as soluble ions to getting nutrition from microbes, the whole plant's behavior completely changes. Their nutritional profile completely changes. Their nutritional requirements completely change. The way they express themselves completely change. So when you think about all of this research, I shouldn't say all perhaps, but the vast majority, like in the high 90 percentile of all the research in the peer-reviewed literature on plant physiology, talking about such very simple and elementary things as root structure and how roots develop and how plants develop, all of that research has been done in laboratory environments or in agricultural environments where plants are fertilized with artificial fertilizers. And what we are now seeing, and we now have the science and the data to back it up and to support it and approve it, to say that when plants begin getting nutrition from microbes, it completely changes their physiology in fundamental ways that we have not accounted for in this large body of existing knowledge. I'll give you one specific example that our internal team has been organizing a document. There's an 80-page document that I'm about a third of the way through that is making my head spin. Something as fundamental as the ability of plants to open and close their stomata. So the way stomata opening and closing has been described is it's mediated by electrolytes, particularly potassium and a couple of others, and that there's a circadian rhythm once a 24-hour cycle, and that stomata open and close relatively slowly. Unless that this has been the historical knowledge. The new knowledge is that there is this, I'm forgetting the precise technical term right now, but there is this I wish it would come back to me, but there is this cavity underneath a stomata that can be filled with endophytes and will be filled with endophytes in a healthy ecosystem. And that when these endophytes are surrounding and supporting the stomata can open and close very rapidly, extremely rapid, so rapidly, in fact, that it can capture, and these endophytes can utilize the plant's waste resources when it is in photorespiration mode. So it can actually capture and reutilize carbon dioxide that is being released. It can capture ammonium that is being released. And so stomata can actually open and close several orders of magnitude more rapidly than what has previously been understood when they are in the presence of these beneficial endophytes. That's just one. This paper has probably 20 such mechanisms in it, where we're now understanding that the way we thought plants operated is fundamentally different from the way plants actually operate in the presence of a supportive microbiome. It's like we've been studying these plants in laboratory conditions and not in real world actual conditions. And I know I'm speaking with very broad brushstrokes here because there has been some research done on non-domesticated plants, but it's a very tiny fraction. And so you compound, I'll give you one more example. When plants have elevated levels of lipids and waxes on the leaf surface, something I've been talking about for years, these plants and the leaves become very sensitive and extremely good at shifting leaf angle in a single day throughout. As the sun arcs across the sky, the leaves track the sun perfectly. This is not a phenomena that is commonly observed because many plants don't have it. This is a function. This is a mechanism that is driven by biological nutrition from biology, not from, and you completely shut down this process when you start giving plants surplus nitrogen. So most people have never observed it, but you actually increase photoreception and the quantity of sunlight collected by something in the neighborhood of 40 to 60%. More sunlight intercepted when plants are getting good biological nutrition. There's just two examples. There's many more, but to the point that you just shared and that our attendee just shared, thank you for that point. Many of us, the data can only show us what is, and many of us have no concept of what could be, what we should be aspiring to.
Thanks. And you haven't really even touched on this, but you're getting toward it, is just the complexity of the design of nature and how we can think that we can design this or that we can improve on this, I think is just kind of mind-blowing. Ian Gold had a great question here, or a comment really, in response to your comments about AI's inability to replace humans. Ian would say that AI will replace many of the average performing people in many roles. A person is just as capable of not using their faculties because of emotional decision making or having a skewed lens that they look at a problem through. AI will bring huge opportunities for the best operators to act better across larger areas. This will significantly reduce the need for support staff unless they're highly skilled. So what do you think of this, and how does this fit into this framework of how we can use technology to help get more people onto the land and steward it, as opposed to just getting only the very intelligent people onto the land?
Um, the thought that comes to my mind is when we look at the patterns of history, it seems invariably we have increasing polarization, where we have wider and wider distribution between, well, just if we look at, you promised at the beginning of this conversation we wouldn't talk about politics, so we won't talk about politics, but look at the polarization of political points of view. I'm still a relatively young man. There's many people who have decades more experience than I do, but I'm imagining, uh, I'm imagining that we have the last 20 years of electoral history that I remember. We've never had quite the degree of intensive polarization of political points of view that we do at the moment. Um, and that polarization just seems to be constantly expanding. And similarly, when we when we take that thought and we transfer it to people's level of engagement and their skill level, um, it has always been true that a minority of take any given population, that a minority of the population has greater appetites for innovation, greater appetites for risk, and greater appetites for learning. And by the way, these are not correlated with each other. But there are some people who are constantly learning who over time become much more skillful and much more aware than others do in their various domains. And I would suggest the opportunity exists when as AI is adopted, I would expect there will be increasing polarization. People, scientists with a more mechanistic worldview will be delighted with the ability of AI and its ability to facilitate even more rapid development of technology that we might perceive as being more destructive to ecosystems. The development of new pesticides, for example, or the development of new DNA slicing and dicing technologies. Um, so I would expect to see increasing polarization from that regard. But from a human skill set perspective, there will be a greater need for more skillful humans than there has ever been before. The only question is, will the economic resources be guided in such a way as to facilitate that? In other words, will, I'll just use the farming context for the moment, will farmers continue to be farmed to such an extent that there are not the economic resources on the farm to facilitate more people coming back to the farm? So this comes back to the whole conversation about decommoditization and facilitating supply webs. To the fundamental piece that needs to be regenerated is the capacity for stewardship. We need to get more people back on the landscape and they need to be compensated very well. And our ability to accomplish that is going to determine our ability to have more stewards in the landscape.
I wonder if, as a example, just I'd like to hear you think through this kind of on the fly here. So Taylor, our owner, actually wrote an article for this last issue of Acres USA as well about GPS collars for cattle. Maybe talk through that as an example of, on the one hand, if every cow had a GPS collar on, theoretically, maybe the grazers wouldn't need to go out and see them very much. They wouldn't be on the land as much. But on the other hand, you are able to track what every cow and every calf does a lot more. You would know if you have one that's lost. You would know if one is going to the water or not, and you might be able to tell, disease if one of them is sick. What do you think about that as an example? Is that the type of technology that is going to help bring more people onto the land and help steward the land, or is it going to have the opposite effect?
Benjamin Franklin has this interesting quote where he says, "Nothing is good or bad, but thinking makes it so." And we miss the point that he was trying to make generally, I think, by taking that statement at surface value. We assume that he meant that if we think something is good, it's good, and if we think something is bad, it's bad. And I haven't spoken to Benjamin Franklin, so I don't know what he was actually thinking. But what I get out of that statement is another level deeper. Nothing is good or bad, except whether you use it consciously or not. Think about it that way. So within the Amish communities and the use of technology, technology is increasingly being adopted because in the business world today, if you are a contractor that is building houses or providing cabinets, it is increasingly difficult to do business without using email and so forth. Um, I, I'm not persuaded that technology is inherently bad or inherently evil. The question is, are you using it consciously? Are you aware of its potential downsides? Many of us tend to operate much of our lives from habit and therefore from our subconscious rather than from conscious. So in the case of the electric collars, are we consciously aware that one downside of these collars is that it could keep us from it could reduce our interaction with the cattle and with the landscape. If we're consciously aware of that and we make a deliberate conscious choice to offset that and to spend more time out there, or as much time as we have in the past, or as maybe a better way of saying it is as much time as is necessary to make very good observations, very thoughtful observations, then that possible downside doesn't become a certain downside. And that goes for both ends of the spectrum, for both the positives and the negatives. So it's really a question, in my mind, of conscious, deliberate use and being the master of technology rather than permitting technology to be the master of you.
Good, thanks. We'll close with one or two more. Maybe if you can talk just a little bit, there's been some questions about technologies such as something for consumers that would show the nutrient value of food that consumers are going to eat. Handheld technology to do leaf nutrition analysis. Could you talk through some of those technologies and how they are going to help steward the land and move regenerative agriculture forward?
Well, I'd like to respond to those by perhaps saying something differently than from what has been said before, because I think many have argued that the use of these sensors, when consumers have access to information about what defines quality, then they will therefore choose to purchase higher quality, and that will exert pressure on supply chains. I don't agree with that premise. And I don't agree with it. I've put a lot of thought into it, but it's perhaps beyond the scope for us to discuss briefly. But in brief, I'm not able to observe a single trend in the food supply chain that I'm aware of, and I've asked lots of people to challenge me on this. I'm not aware of a single trend where that produced significant change. I'm not talking about incremental 1 or 2 or 5 or 10% change, but significant change. Let's call significant change, for the sake of discussion, greater than 20%. I'm not aware of any movement that has caused a change greater than 20% in supply chains and the way that food is produced as a result of positive demand. There have been several recorded instances of negative demand. Negative demand is when you have the presence of salmonella in spinach or some type of food contamination. There's a significant recall. When Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle, there was a 40% drop in the consumption of meat in a matter of months. That was an example of negative demand. So there are several instances of negative demand having on negative consumer demand creating significant change. I can't find a single one in history of positive demand creating significant change. And I believe we stand at a moment in time where significant change is needed. I didn't sign up to be a driver and to be a contributor to regenerative agriculture to have 5% or 10% change over the next 40 years. That's not why I'm here. That's not what I care about. We want significant change. So how do we accomplish that? Um, so with that as a sidebar, coming back to how will how could these in-field sensors being able to measure food quality, nutritional quality in plants and so forth, how could they change the landscape? Um, I think this is my personal opinion, and I could very well be wrong. I've been wrong many times about making forecasts, but I think that these sensors will be very valuable to growers and to agronomists because you are essentially now carrying a digital laboratory in your pocket where you no longer need to send leaf samples or plant or soil samples to a laboratory. Well, soil samples are a different story, but you no longer need to send plant samples to a laboratory for analysis and get a result weeks or months later. You get rapid results. There's tremendous value in that. So I think about these things as a digital lab that are going to be very valuable for agronomic management. But then if there is going to be significant change in the supply webs that is driven by a desire for quality, actually, there's another thought on consumer demand that um, I'll come back to that. If if there is a positive demand for quality that will result in significant supply chain movement, I don't believe it'll come from consumers. I believe it will come from the people who would benefit from improved quality in storage and transportation. So if you produce fruits and vegetables that no longer rot and decompose, but they only dehydrate, and you take an heirloom tomato from a shelf life of 5 days to a shelf life of 50 days, there's tremendous value in that. And that is something that can be measured and can be quantified and can be achieved. But the value in that is for the distribution, the supply web, more so than it is for the consumer. And in the short to mid term, I think that is probably what is going to drive change in the supply chain more than consumer demand. And another reason for why I believe that consumer demand is not a significant driver of change is that I believe the majority of consumers are I've had a number of conversations the last several months where people have been referencing NPCs, non-player characters. The majority of people are sleepwalking through life. They are very happy to consume whatever is on the grocery store shelf, whatever is served at fast food restaurants that appeals to their senses, with paying very little attention to its ingredients or what it is comprised of. The reality is, if the majority of consumers really cared about food quality, then the food that gets consumed in this country would be very different from what it is. But they are walking through life in subconscious habits, not being consciously aware. And so, because of that, and because of how subconsciously we behave and how technology has had this effect on our brains, our minds, and our presence in the world, because most of us no longer perceive and no longer pay attention, then I am not optimistic about consumer demand driving significant change. I think there can be significant change, but I think it will come from policy, and I think it will come from supply chain benefits, not from consumer benefits. And that's unfortunate. It's unfortunate if that is true, but that's my perspective at the moment.
It's a bit of a dim perspective to end on, unfortunately, but I think you're right. Um, there are a bunch of other questions I'm sure I'm sorry we can't get to. Let's finish with one more. John Chester asks if you have any thoughts on dynamic drone technology for bird and uh, squirrel ground mitigation to prevent damage to fruit in orchards.
I don't have experience with that technology, but it we whenever we have technology, see this drone technology for um, as an antidote to animal predation is interesting because when you think about the dynamics here, what drones are doing is they are imitating or amplifying natural pressure that should already exist. And so one example that comes to mind is a berry grower that we worked with in the Pacific Northwest years ago had falcons for bird control. And of course, falcons get tired. You can only fly them so frequently. And so there's a limited area that you can cover with a group of a dozen falcons or whatever. I think he had half a dozen one day when we were there visiting. And so the way they amplified the effect of the falcons was with an RC plane, remote controlled small airplane that imitated in size and speed a falcon. So they would fly a falcon and then bring it back. And if birds showed up again immediately thereafter, they would fly the drone or fly the remote controlled airplane and fly it directly through the flock of birds as a falcon would move. And the birds would be terrified. So that is an example of using technology to amplify natural ecosystem effects, not to displace them or to replace them, but to amplify them. And generally, the exposure that I've had to technologies used in that way, I would suggest that they're generally positive. So I think there is tremendous opportunity. There are so many technological developments, and they're going to continue to evolve. When I look at, let's think of it this way. And we've been talking about technology in terms of, largely in terms of hardware and software to some degree, but and electronic hardware and software. But technology is also new product innovations. As I've been reading this document that our team has put together on how plants grown in undomesticated ecosystems or plants grown with a healthy microbiome have fundamentally different physiology. What if we had applied the same degree of technological innovation for the last 70 years to developing and amplifying that system as we have to developing and amplifying the system that is based on artificial nutrients and pesticides? And think about what might be uncovered over the next 20 years with research in metabolomics and genomics and all these various large data areas. If we apply this, it is reasonable for us to expect we should see a wave of innovation in new biocontrols and new plant immune enhancing products. The ability to turn on plant immune systems or to amplify plant immune systems by triggering the microbiome in a certain way, or in many different ways. There are tremendous innovations that I expect to emerge, technological innovations that I expect to emerge in the next 10 to 20 years that could have been developed a long time ago, but resources were largely guided and directed in another direction. So there is a lot of technological innovation that I expect to happen in the next couple of decades that will be very exciting because it will be based on a different understanding of the organism than the one that we have had in the past.
Well, thank you. That's a great note to end on. I think we can be very optimistic about the future of agriculture. So thank you so much, John. Thank you for all who attended here. This is recorded and we'll have it up on our website in a little bit. We'll send out an email with a link to that article that John wrote in the November issue of Acres USA. You can learn more about John, of course, at johnkempf.com or at aea.com, and more about us at acresusa.com. Our conference again coming up in December. John will be there. You can learn from him, Gabe Brown, Alan Williams, Joel Salatin, Jay Fuhrer, more. The website.
May I interrupt for just a
Please,
moment? I
please.
think at the conference, if I have all my names correct, there's going to be a closing panel that I've been asked to moderate with Joel Salatin and Gabe Brown and maybe is it Gary Zimmer or Will Harris?
I
Or
think
maybe
Will
all
Harris
four of
and
them
Jay Fuhrer as
and
well.
Jay
Yes.
Fear. All
Gary
on the
Zimmer.
same
Here's
time.
him.
All on the stage at the same time. Where else can you experience that?
And I don't know that we've definitively decided what that topic is going to be, but I like the idea of herbicide versus tillage. You guys
Ah.
duke it out. So, all right. Well, thank you so much again, and we will hope to see and hear from many of you soon. Have a great afternoon.